Thanks, Whitley. Well, at first, the idea that poisonous cane toads, originally from Venezuela, South America, would crawl out of a lake near Hamburg, Germany, and explode to death sounds like a Monty Python comedy. But over 5 days between April 3rd and April 7th of 2005, an estimated 1,000 cane toads did exactly that. This week, I talked to Werner Smolnik, the Hamburg, Germany project leader for NABU, the oldest German society for protection of plants and animals. He watched this baffling phenomenon with his own eyes, and Mr. Smolnik told me, quote, "The toads, they came out of the water onto the land, and in the time of 10 minutes, they increased to nearly 4 times their normal size and then exploded. I have seen the toad intestines flying 1 meter," unquote. Several exploded toad carcasses were delivered to Hamburg city veterinarian Dr. Otto Horst. He told me that he had never seen such toad explosions before and confirmed that so far no chemicals, pesticides, bacteria, or viruses have been found that might explain these toad explosions.
Linda, I'm sorry, it's just killing me. I know it's not funny, but it is terribly funny. But go ahead.
Well, it's also, it's like another warning flag in the environment.
Oh, undoubtedly, it's going to turn out to be something horrendous. But go ahead, keep going. I'm sorry to interrupt you.
That's all right. Mr. Smolnik told me that he was trying to research a rumor that similar cane toad deaths occurred in South America in 2002 to 2003, but neither of us have been able to find any past news reports. One theory was that horses were transporting a toxic yeast from mushrooms into river and lake water. But Dr. Horst told me he does not think that is the explanation in Hamburg. Mr. Smolnik said that he had not received any more exploding toad reports after April 7th, but on April 25th, about 200 miles north of Hamburg in Aarhus County, Denmark, the Ritzau news agency reported, quote, "A large number of toads in Lasby, Middle Jutland, northwest of Copenhagen, have begun to climb on land where they swell up and explode. The toad's intestines are thrown almost a meter in the air after the toads explode. Investigators found a rock covered with the bodies of many dead exploded toads. The toads seem to be exploding between 2 a.m. and 3 a.m. in the night," unquote. Well, perhaps the exploding cane toads is caused by people deliberately poisoning them in some way. Anywhere that the poisonous cane toads turn up, people begin wanting to kill them. 5 months ago, on November 4th, 2004, David Tallner, a member of the Australian Parliament, used his official post to call for the, quote, "bashing of poisonous cane toads with cricket bats and golf clubs," unquote. Cane toads were brought to Queensland from South America in the 1930s to try to control beetles that were destroying sugarcane fields on the northern Australian coasts. But the cane toads, which have poisonous sacs on their back of their heads that can kill crocodiles, snakes, and other animals in literally minutes, they have spread so rapidly now in Australia that there are millions. The Australian Northern Territory government has been spending $1 million recently to research biotechnological remedies to the toad invasion. Maybe someone is testing one of those remedies in the German and Denmark waters. And at the end of this Dreamland program, I'll have another Earth mystery from the skies over Sonora, California, west of Yosemite National Park.
Well, Linda, there's an awful lot of weird stuff going on. We have a story up on Unknown Country the past couple of days that to the effect that not only are toads exploding, but dogs in Glasgow are committing suicide by all jumping off the same spot on a bridge in the middle of the city. Exactly. What is going on this planet? Absolutely. Linda Moulton Howe's ever fabulous website, earthfiles.com. Do not miss it. Go to earthfiles.com frequently. Subscribe to earthfiles.com. It's well worth it. Stay abreast of what's happening in your world. The conventional media does not help you. It will not help you. This is where the real information is found. Well, I'm very happy and proud to have with me today Russell Targ. Russell Targ is one of the inventors of remote viewing, along with Dr. Hal Puthoff. You talk about getting it from the horse's mouth. This is the man who really knows what it's all about. He is now back again for a remarkably interesting reason. The original book on remote viewing, Mind Reach, out of print and unobtainable for years, is now available again, and you can get it from the unknowncountry.com store. You can get it in bookstores everywhere. And Russell, of course, is one of the authors, along with the famous and elusive Hal Puthoff, a dear friend of mine who will not, under any circumstances, talk with me on my radio program. But nevertheless, he does exist, contrary to all indications otherwise. Hal and Russell were really the pioneers of remote viewing in this country. And there's also, Russell has published a paper in the AAAS journal, and a lot of previously secret remote viewing material has been made public. So we're going to be going through that today, and I think you're going to find it fascinating. And this is one of these programs that Dreamland is really all about. It's about empowerment. And one of the things that hurts us in our growth psychically is the relentless drilling into our minds that we are nothing more than a physical body. And this comes to us, everything the consumer society has to say at its core is this, and it is constricting and starving our relationship with other levels of reality. Here is a scientist we're going to be talking to who is comfortable not only with other levels of reality, but understands the science of why they're real. Welcome to the program, Russell Targ.
I'm very happy to be with you. I'm glad to talk with you about some of my favorite subjects.
Well, good. Well, let's begin at the beginning. One of the things that we never get to hear is the story of how you came to the remote viewing idea in the first place.
Well, remote viewing was brought to us by Ingo Swann, who was a New York artist and prodigious psychic before we started our program at SRI.
Now, how did you
grew up in
Ingo?
New York as a street kid visiting magic shops on 42nd Street. And I was an amateur magician. And like many amateur magicians, I had the experience that from time to time, I would get flashes of hidden information pertaining to the trick I was doing that could supplement my sleight of hand or my trickery by some genuine ESP. And in talking with other magicians, even though they may hate psychic functioning, it's well known that when you're standing on a stage with the lights in your eyes, you're in a kind of hypnagogic state and open to psychic abilities. So as a young physics student, I became interested in the real examination of psychic abilities rather than the stage magic, and I began to pursue that and built an ESP teaching machine. And then to answer your question, in 1972, Hal Puthoff and I got together to form a research program at Stanford Research Institute to investigate whether we could teach people how to get in touch with the part of themselves that's psychic. While Hal and I were both physicists, we were taught by Ingo Swann about remote viewing, the ability to quiet your mind and describe and experience what's going on in distant places. And we became very, very good at helping people learn to do remote viewing, to describe things hundreds of thousands of miles away. And Ingo taught Hal and me to do remote viewing. Hal and I taught 6 people from Army intelligence who were supporting our program. So the Army formed a parallel program to Stanford Research Institute, and we trained 6 of the Army intelligence people how to use remote viewing, basically to spy on the Russians and do other operational things. And those 6 people have now trained the world. So that if you go to Google on the Internet and search for remote viewing in quotation marks, when we started, of course, there was no remote viewing. And then when I wrote my first book, there were 60,000, and we thought that was quite amazing. And there are now 365,000 sites pertaining to remote viewing.
It's amazing.
So although the physics community hasn't quite caught on yet, it appears that the rest of the world is very interested in psychic abilities.
Now, I have to ask you, and I want to start out sort of at this point, because many of the listeners here are people who want this to work for them. They want to be in contact with their psychic abilities. They believe that they are there, but their psychic abilities are not as real to them as their feet and hands and their eyes. How does it work? As a scientist, tell me how you think remote viewing works.
Well, there's really 2 questions you're asking. One is, how can people get in touch with their psychic abilities? And the other, what is the physical description of how it works? On the physics side, which is actually the harder question, as you've no doubt heard, modern science has finally figured out that we live in a non-local space-time. That is a space-time in which separation is an illusion. And Einstein and Schrödinger knew that in the 1930s. Schrödinger embraced it, and Einstein hated it. Einstein called it a spooky connection at a distance. But the understanding that modern physics has, and this is not controversial, is that things like elementary particles and photons that were raised together, like identical twins raised together and then separated, these photons traveling away from one another at the speed of light are still connected. They still have a profound influence one upon the other. So this is called a non-local connection because Einstein's relativity says that particles traveling away from each other at the speed of light cannot, in fact, affect each other. But we now know that this entanglement really exists. And it exists for photons and it exists for the minds of people. That is, we have entangled minds. If I quiet my mind and look at an object in my hand on my desk, and you and I were doing an experiment, I could lead you to quiet your mind and describe the interesting object I have in my hand, even over the air. In fact, it was my job to help support the research program we had at SRI, and the way I would do that is that we would be visited year by year by government scientists and bureaucrats who would want to see something psychic, and my job was to lead them into an experience of a quiet mind so they could describe what it looks like where their buddy is hiding. And this is the kind of psychic hide-and-seek that we did for 2 decades. And the encouraging thing is that psychic abilities are very easy to foster. The reason that there's 300,000 websites pertaining to remote viewing is that every time somebody takes a class in remote viewing, and there are lots of people, particularly from the Army program, lots of people were teaching remote viewing, this is actually very easy to teach. So that people go to a class in remote viewing, learn to quiet their mind, and discover that they can now find their car keys and locate parking places and other mundane things. And they think that's very excited. And they say, well, that's cool. And they start to teach people how to do remote viewing. This is a great American cottage industry. And so to replace the fortune tellers and the palm readers, there are now people teaching remote viewing. The way it works is that we live in a profoundly interconnected universe. Now, the Buddhists knew this from the earliest times. The idea that separation is an illusion, that there's only one of us here in consciousness, is really a premier idea in the writings of the Buddha and the Prajnaparamita. Every page says, one way or another, that there's no separation in consciousness. And the way you can learn to do this, the other easier part of your question, is that if you find a friend who will work with you and the friend brings you a little object in a grocery bag, that friend can then sit down with you and help you separate out the psychic signal pertaining to the object from your mental noise, which would be guessing and analysis and memory and grasping for the answer. So the main secret in remote viewing is that remote viewing is a non-analytical ability, which is to say, if I hold an object in my hand, you're pretty unlikely to tell me what it is, because that would be an analytical naming task. But you are quite likely, if you quiet your mind, to tell me about the shape and the form and the color, and then after a little while, the whole object would unfold for you. And I've been teaching remote viewing in many countries and all over the place, and it's very rewarding because people are very, very successful at learning to do that. So it's easy to teach. How it actually works is more complicated because it really involves expanding your awareness into another aspect of space-time than we're familiar with. But modern physics is finally catching up with us.
And in catching up with it, can you give us some particular instances of how it's catching up?
Well, if I were a graduate student back in the physics department at Columbia University, I was doing atomic spectroscopy then. If I were in graduate school now, the hottest thing that modern physicists are looking at is the entanglement of elementary particles,
right,
and the whole issue of non-locality. What's very, very exciting right now is that modern physics now recognizes, and this aspect is not controversial, the existence of psychic abilities is still something that scientists argue about. But the extent to which we live in a non-local world is understood.
Yes.
Experiments have been done over many kilometers showing that photons born together are still connected even though they travel away from one another at the speed of light. So modern physics recognizes the non-local connection.
We're going to get into this a little bit more deeply, and we're also going to find out from Russell about some of the secrets that have now been revealed about regarding the remote viewing program. In just a minute, this is Whitley Strieber, It's Dreamland.
You're listening to Whitley Strieber's Dreamland online and on the IBC Radio Network.
This is Whitley Strieber, It's Dreamland. We're talking to Russell Targ, Mind Reach, long out of print, the original book on remote viewing. Scientists Look at Psychic Abilities by Russell Targ and Hal Puthoff, the book that introduced remote viewing to the world, and it will introduce remote viewing to you too. It is that good, and you should certainly take a look at it. ESPresearch.com is Russell Targ's website. That's ESPresearch.com. Do you want to empower yourself? Well, a place to start is probably ESPresearch.com. Russell's been telling us it's easy. It's not hard to do this, and I agree with him. I took a course in remote viewing, a day in this course, and I was amused to discover that aside from me, there were only a couple of other people, the 15 or so people in the room who weren't in law enforcement. They were all DEA people and Border Patrol people and sheriff's deputies and things. And so if you think that that the official world doesn't believe remote viewing works, think again, because they may not be saying it publicly, but they're certainly sending their people to learn how to do it, and for a reason. Russell,
you may not know, Whitley, but one of the things that we're talking about now for the first time is that we worked with the Berkeley Police Department during the kidnapping of Patricia Hearst. That is, Patricia was kidnapped in 1973, I believe, and the day after her kidnapping, the Berkeley police came to us at SRI because they had no idea where she was or what the kidnapping was all about. And of course, she was an heiress, daughter of the Hearst family, a San Francisco Examiner newspaper. And we were then working with a very psychic policeman, the police commissioner for the city of Burbank, named Pat Price, who was one of the really prodigious psychics to cross our path at SRI. And the police asked us to come to the station with us from Palo Alto to Berkeley. And Pat was quite comfortable because he had spent his whole life in police work. So Hal put off, Pat Price and I traveled up to Berkeley, and Pat asked them to show him the mug book, the pictures of all the people who had been kidnapped and in prison in the Berkeley community. And as Pat sat down at a big oak table and turned the pages of this picture book with 4 pictures on a page of convicts and felons, after about 10 pages or 40 pictures, Pat put his finger on the face of one man and said, "That's the ringleader." And he put his finger on Daniel DeVries, who was in fact, a few days later, determined to be the ringleader known as Sin Q. And Pat picked this guy psychically out of a mug book at a time when no one in the whole world knew that he was the perpetrator and the ringleader. And the Berkeley police were very interested in that. They didn't know it was correct at the time. But they said, well, where did they go? Where did they take her? And Pat said, well, when they left the house, which we visited, so this is really outside my job description. I'm a physicist, and we're crawling around under the bed collecting spent cartridges at the scene of the kidnapping. But remote viewers, the psychic researchers have to do all kinds of stuff. But Pat said that if you go north, I see there's a getaway car, a big white station wagon parked by an overpass across the freeway near 2 gas storage tanks and a restaurant just due north of here. And one of the detectives said, I know where that is. I live in that direction. They dispatched a police cruiser, found the white car just where Price said it was. So within a half hour, we were able to find the kidnapped car and identify the perpetrator. That's the good news. That's what we did in day one, and we got a commendation for the Berkeley police. The bad news is that the 2 other agencies working, namely the Alameda County Sheriff's Department and the FBI, all were working separately, and they would not share information. It was just an anticipation of our experience with 9/11. But we couldn't tell the FBI or the sheriff's department what we were doing with each of the other agencies, because each of them wanted the prize of finding Patricia Hearst. So in the course of all the secrecy, even though each of the agencies had a piece of the puzzle, she was indeed not found until a year later, after the big shootout in Los Angeles. But yes, indeed, the police are very interested in psychic abilities and would frequently call us. But this is one of the more spectacular events, and we had not talked about it before. But I thought that was relevant to what you're mentioning, is that you had a lot of policemen in your remote viewing class.
Yes. Well, that counts, I think, as a very spectacular event. And the descriptions of Pat Price and his accomplishments in the book in MindReach are quite amazing. But
in MindReach, we show for the first time things that Price did that had been classified secret,
right,
where Price was able to describe a Soviet research and development facility in Russia. The CIA sent one of their physicists to our laboratory with the geographical coordinates, the latitude and longitude of a Soviet site. And Price was able to quiet his mind, close his eyes, and describe how he was lying psychically on top of a building as a giant crane would roll it back and forth over his body. And he then drew that big 8-wheel crane that had wheels on both sides of the building, and we then showed our CIA man the picture that Price had drawn. We went down into the SRI secure vault where the CIA man was hiding, and we showed him the pictures that Price had drawn, and they then unfolded the satellite photograph of the place. And we now can show for the first time the satellite photographs. The reason the whole thing was in the vault and was secret is because this is 73 and satellite photography was top secret, compartmentalized information. But the CIA man said, yes, indeed, you have described something at the site, but we'd like to know, what are they building inside this building that the crane is rolling over? So Price and I went back to our shielded room where we did our remote viewing, and Price said, I see that they're building a big steel sphere. It's about 60 feet in diameter, and they're welding it together from little pieces shaped like an orange peel. They're having a hard time doing that. And he gave us a number of other descriptions. And 2 years later, the Russians finally rolled this big sphere out of the building. The CIA could confirm that Price described exactly what they were doing, and the CIA understood that this was a containment vessel for a particle beam weapon that the Russians were building to shoot down the satellites that were taking the pictures that we just displayed. So this was a very big success for the SRI program. In fact, this particular success was probably good for another 10 years' support, because as a result of Price's extraordinarily accurate drawing of the crane and the facility, we were subject to a congressional investigation of all what they say, no good deed goes unpunished.
Right.
So we were invited to have a congressional inquiry of our work. Could there have been a security leak that gives some California psychics information that nobody else in the Western world had? And at that hearing, we stood in the well of the House of Representatives, much as President Clinton did a few years ago, defending his administration. So we were defending our program before the House Committee on Intelligence Oversight. And we had our allies from the CIA and Defense Intelligence Agency and Army Intelligence telling the congressman that there was no security leak, that we really did provide them with valuable information, and the consensus was that we should press on, which is what we wanted to hear. What that means is that the government will continue to fund us. And indeed, one of the most remarkable things about our program at SRI is that we had 23 years of continuous funding from the U.S. government intelligence community. And from my experience working for the government, both before and after SRI, as a researcher, as a research physicist, if you get 3 years funding for a program, you're really doing well. Because when I worked at Lockheed Missiles and Space, we were putting lasers on airplanes to avoid wind shear, actually doing something useful for airplane safety. And it was a big struggle to get as much as 3 years funding to actually do something to save lives and improve airplane safety. But our SRI program was supported for 23 years by the same group of agencies. And that in itself is one of the more paranormal things about the program.
We're going to find out more about the program and also about what happened to it in just a couple of minutes. This is Whitley Strieber. It's Dreamland. We're back. We're talking to Russell Targ. His book, Mind Reach, Scientists Look at Psychic Abilities. If you're hesitant and you can't believe that you could really do any of this, you need to get Mind Reach because you need to empower yourself. You wouldn't be listening to this radio program if you didn't understand that and care about it. And even if you don't need to empower you, even if you are able to do it, Mind Reach is, first of all, fascinating, and it's a really, really strengthening book to read because you can see the methodologies that were used, the care that was taken, and it will convince you that there is something in this. Russell's website, ESP Research. Is that right, Russell? ESP?
ESPresearch.com.
Yeah, that's right. ESPresearch.com. Russell, we were talking about the remarkable 23-year history of the program and its success, but what happened to it?
Well, by 1995, the Cold War was over, the Berlin Wall was down, and the government, in its wisdom, decided that the United States no longer had any enemies. So even as silly as that sounds, the government agencies took a lot of kidding about psychic research. There were two groups of people in the government who didn't like our program. There were people who didn't have the clearances to know about the information we were providing that was very valuable because it was a secret program. So there were people who had the idea that the government was supporting ESP in California, and that sounded just too crazy for words, especially since they were giving us millions of dollars. But the government, we were publishing papers in Nature and the Proceedings of the Engineering Society, but we couldn't talk about the things we were doing, looking into China, looking into Iran, looking into Russia. You and I can talk about them, but at the time they were classified.
Right.
So the group of people who felt that these California psychics were wasting a lot of money. There was no such thing as ESP. There were also religious fundamentalists within the CIA and Defense Intelligence Agency who said, of course there's psychic ability, but it's all from the devil.
Also in the Congress. I know that because I was very involved at one point with some of these very people, and in some ways that I found most annoying and difficult to handle. What's surprising is that there is a large contingent of people within the intelligence community who believe that, who are fundamentalists, and they were concentrated, incidentally, at one point in the Soviet Russia division, which was why the United States simply refused to acknowledge the possibility that the Soviet Union could be collapsing because they were so sure that the passages about the bear and the eagle in the Bible referred to the great battle of Armageddon that would be fought between the Soviet Union and the United States, and they just couldn't believe it.
Yeah, I have heard that.
Just utterly inadequate people. Shouldn't be in the government at all.
Yeah, it was really people within the CIA who thought that our work was devilish were some of our greatest antagonists, even concerning our outstanding work for the intelligence organization. But we had all sorts of remarkable things that we looked at. We looked at an atomic bomb test in China, where Ingo Swann was asked to describe what would be happening at some particular coordinates 3 days in the future. And the most interesting thing that I would have to tell you about psychic abilities, we know for a fact, we don't know a lot for a fact, but we know some things for a fact about psychic abilities. And one of them is, as a consequence of its being non-local, we observe that it's no harder to describe what's going on 10,000 miles away than it is across the street. That is, I can hold my head right next to the head of another person, and I can visualize something, and that person can often tell me what I'm visualizing. That's a case where there's just a few inches between us. That works just as well when the people are across the country. So increasing things by 1,000 times, which if it were electromagnetic waves would cut it down by 1,000,000 times, doesn't cut it down whatsoever. Similarly, it's no harder to describe. If I were doing an experiment with you, I could say, I'm going to choose a picture to show you tomorrow, which you haven't chosen yet. Can you tell me what picture is randomly going to appear on your screen tomorrow? That's no harder for you to do than to describe the picture I have in my hand right now. So looking into the far distance and looking into the future is just as easy as describing the object I'm holding in my hand. And that's the consequence. That's what you would expect from a non-local ability.
That's absolutely fascinating. Are you holding something in your hand now?
Yes, I am.
I wonder if I can see it. That's
if you quiet your mind.
A little hard to quiet my mind while I'm trying to do an interview, but if something...
to make for some dead air. This is a hard thing for you to do while you're... What is the shape that comes to view? What's the interesting shape that comes to view?
I'm not getting a thing. If I do, though, it'll come in sort of the side door, and I will report on it.
You'll let me know.
Yeah, I will let you know, because I absolutely can't do a remote viewing.
Hard to fly the plane and close your eyes.
Well, right. Folks, I must admit that you've discovered something about me. I cannot walk, indeed, and chew gum at the same time. But if you never know, because this is always happens in the is it egg-shaped?
You might think of an egg. What are you experiencing?
I'm thinking of a vase or an egg.
Yeah, I would say if you made a little sketch, there's something about this that would make you think of an egg.
Huh. Interesting. Well, that's what I've got so far.
Well, you're on the right track.
Okay. Well, let's keep on with our interview. I would like to talk to you now about the end of the program, or what I would call the apparent end of the program, and the emergence of James Schnabel and his book on the program. What do you think of that? I happen to know the editor who published that book, and he was horrified to learn after the book was published that Mr. Schnabel had been in some way connected with the Central Intelligence Agency.
Well, the program was supported by the Central Intelligence Agency. So I think Schnabel's book was basically correct. Like any person involved with the program who appears in a book, I immediately went to Schnabel's book to see what did he say about Russell Targ.
Right.
And what he said is that my sister was married to the chess player Bobby Fischer. Now, the thing that's the matter with that is I don't actually have a sister, and Bobby Fischer is not married to anyone. So I thought that was a bad start.
Yeah.
The truth of that is that my wife at the time was Bobby Fischer's sister. And my wife has passed away since then. So Schnabel had the germ of the right idea, but he had the facts entirely wrong. And I thought that was a bad sign. But
yeah.
we did have a program. He talked to a number of the people. And I have no big problem with Schnabel's books. It's relatively free of things outside the program. But I'm interested in now, since we've learned that psychic abilities can be used to see the future as well as the present. When we had a lot of money at SRI, we also had a lot of recognition. Nova made a film about us. We would appear in the New York Times and the Wall Street Journal. And that's because in America, money talks. There was a time right after I left the program that we used a variation of remote viewing to forecast changes in the silver commodity market. It was called associative remote viewing, which we can talk about if you'd like. But in 9 forecasts of the silver commodity market on the commodity exchange over 9 weeks, we were correct every week in our forecast, whether silver was going up or down, a lot or a little bit. All of our forecasts were right, And simply using remote viewing and nothing else, we made in excess of $120,000. Now that excited Nova, who made a nice film called The Case of ESP, and the Wall Street Journal and the New York Times had good stories about us. But because the news follows the money, as the money disappeared, the program was closed, people have forgotten about psychic abilities and the fact that they even exist. So I have revived this associative remote viewing. I'm working with a few dozen people across the country, and we're again looking into the future to forecast changes this time in the S&P 500. Now, my interest in this is entirely education, or the Russians would say propaganda.
Mine would not be education, I have to admit. I would love to know where the S&P 500 was going. I traded the S&P 500 for years.
See, I was invited to Russia a couple of times. I got a letter from the Soviet Academy of Sciences say, please come to Russia so we can exchange propaganda. And they basically recognize that there's a thin division between information and propaganda. But what I believe is that if we can reconstitute this program, find a way to reliably predict changes in the market, then there will again be a resurgence of interest in psychic abilities, and we can start to train people, and there'll be research activities. So the combination in the 80s and 90s of psychic research for the government with $1 million program and making money in the silver market, there had been a big interest in remote viewing, many, many books being published. But as the government support went away after the Cold War and the laboratories started to close, acceptance of psychic abilities started to go away.
And that is a weakening of the human species. When we get back, I'm going to read to Russell from the book The Key, because there's something very important there that relates to his work, and I'd like to get his opinion of it. We'll be right back. This is Whitley Strieber. We're back with Russell Targ. His book, Mind Reach. Scientists look at psychic abilities. Get it from the Unknown Country bookstore, or get it from your local bookstore, or get it from Russell's website. You can get it just about anywhere. ESPresearch.com is Russell Targ's website. Russell, before we left the air, I mentioned my book, The Key. The Key has been quite important to me in that I have been sometime, I believe it was in June of 1999, I found myself talking to a man with an exceptional mind. I do not know to this day exactly who this gentleman was, and I won't pretend now that I know any more about him than I did when I first met him. I've never been able to find him subsequently, but he was I think was the most intelligent human being, if indeed he was a human being, I've ever met. He showed up in the middle of the night when I was in a hotel room in Toronto and knocked on the door. I thought he was the room service waiter and opened the door and ended up in this extraordinary conversation. Now, part of this conversation had to do with something you were discussing with me earlier about superposition and quantum entanglement. I'll just read one thing he said about quantum entanglement to set this up briefly, without asking you to comment on it, because I suspect you would agree with it. And then I'm going to read the part I would like you to comment upon. You think, he said, we were talking about entanglement of particles. He said, you think now that you must separate two photons physically for them to be entangled. So your faster-than-light communications are limited by how far apart you can physically place the photons you entangle. But there was a time when all particles were in communication, and so all are entangled. When you realize this, it will also be true that your quantum communications devices will be able to communicate instantaneously across all worlds. Did you notice the interesting connection there between the process of thinking and the way the communications devices would work? I say that as an aside. And then he goes on, but until you realize and understand it, it will not be true for you. Vision in the manipulation of quantum reality, as in the perfecting of your being, is everything. Now he goes on. I talked about a little bit about the relationship between the spirit and the and science, and to him, spiritual development and scientific knowledge were the same thing. Then I asked him, what role does superposition play in higher communication? He said this: the tiny layer of electrons that lies outside of the skin is an organ in itself, just like the eyes or the blood. It is a sensory organ, but not one that operates naturally except in a few, as I have stated before. Even in them, it can't be used very effectively without higher consciousness. It is the organ of higher consciousness. You must be able to watch and not watch this at the same time. When you learn this, it will stay in superposition even as you take the imagery that it is receiving into your brain and process it. There is a mechanism being described there, Russell, of psychic communication. That there is literally a psychic organ, and he's telling us how to use it. Does this make any sense to you at all, based on your own research and experience?
Well, I'm impressed with the discussion of both watching and non-watching, which is a very Buddhist idea involving surrendering your judgment. You probably remember in the ancient Vedic teachings, it is before the Buddhists.
Sure, of course.
Principal teaching is that Atman, which is your own self or awareness, your Atman, is the same as Brahman, which is the whole non-local physical and non-physical space-time. So the teaching 1,500 years before Christ, 3,500 years ago, the core of Hindu teaching, that Atman equal Brahman, says that your awareness is one with all of physical and non-physical space-time. And as people become more and more aware of this, they become able to make use of and participate in their non-local awareness. And as they learn to do remote viewing, what they conclude, it's not a matter of belief, but as they expand their awareness, people have the experience that they could not possibly just be a physical body.
Right.
And in fact, who they are is this non-local awareness, because we know bodies come and go, but our awareness is able to participate and experience both in the distance and in the future, all of which is totally independent of your physical body. So this aspect of yourself is, when someone asks you, who are you? The answer would not be, I'm a physicist, I'm a writer, I'm an interviewer. The answer would be, I am non-local awareness residing for a time in this body. Now, as we know, bodies are hard to come by, so we take good care of our body and respect them. But it's a cause of suffering if you get attached to your body and begin to think that body is who you actually are. And this is, of course, very ancient teaching. The Hindus explain this explicitly. Our friend Schrödinger, the great physicist of the 1930s, wrote about it with the idea that consciousness is a singular of which there is no plural. There appear to be many consciousness, many awareness, but it's an optical illusion, as though you're standing in a hall of mirrors. That is, there one consciousness, many bodies. And as we learn to quiet our mind and expand our awareness, we are able to freely participate in that expanded awareness. It's a gift.
Remarkable. How far along are you?
How are you doing with the image that was popping into your awareness?
It is not. I'm not able to do this at this time. It isn't.
Would you like me to tell you what I've got?
Yeah, sure. Since it just is not possible to without taking my mind off of what you're saying, I can't do it, and I can't very well interview you without knowing what you're saying. So
you said you saw something like an eggshell.
An egg shape, I said, or something like a vase. It seemed to be curves in it.
Well, what I have is the object is a magnifying glass, and it has a eggshell-colored white plastic handle and a white plastic rim going around the magnifying glass. So if a judge were to try and match your object up against, see, in all of our fortune telling, we want to know, is the market going up and down?
Right.
So we would say, somebody may have said, well, if the market goes up, I will show you the white plastic magnifying glass, and if it goes down, I'll show you the electric clock.
Yeah.
Or I'll show you the book, or I'll show you the stapling machine. I'm just looking at things on my desk. So the evaluator would have no problem figuring out that the only egg-shaped thing in the pair that we had made, because of course we would make something, a pair quite different using different objects. So just the fact that you said that you saw something that was egg-shaped and round would be enough for them to pick out the magnifying glass and reject the other object. So based on what you said, we would either buy or sell the S&P 500, depending on what the association was.
Well, that makes a sort of sense. I'm not so sure I'd be willing to put my money on it, I have to tell you. It's a little scary.
It can be done.
Interesting, very interesting. The S&P 500 loses or gains $250 per point, I think. And it moves fast.
We like it because of its volatility. We're in the morning and out in the evening.
Were you making money?
Yes.
Oh, my.
Because we'll buy, anyway, it's a long story. We'll buy 5 contracts on margin. We have 40 people playing with us, and it's all for research. Some people hope to make money. We have quite a bit of money invested, but what we're doing this for, some of us are interested in demonstrating that psychic abilities can be used in a reliable way. As we have 40 people, so that if 18 say up and 6 say down, that's a preponderance. If you have 50, if you have 20% up and 20% down, then you pass. There's always, you need a substantial majority in one direction or the other.
Right.
So this is a research project. I wouldn't quit your day job yet. But this kind, in Mind Reach, we discussed this kind of associative remote viewing, as how to harness a weak psychic ability and make use of it in a error-correcting way.
Well, it's certainly a fascinating the whole story. It's really, Russell, you and Hal and those who worked with you have become an important part of the history of this country and also a very important part of its future. It's been a pleasure having you with us on Dreamland. The book, Mind Reach, Scientists Look at Psychic Abilities. This is, you talk about being from the horse's mouth. Russell Targ and Hal Puthoff, the two men who started it all. Russell's website, espresearch.com. Next up, Linda Moulton Howe. You're about to experience something that you just can't get elsewhere. Emmy Award-winning science reporter Linda Moulton Howe reporting on the absolute leading edge of science discovery and the true mysteries of the unknown. Don't miss her website, earthfiles.com, the one science website that tells you the secret and gives you the facts that others dare not. earthfiles.com. This week she's reporting on extraordinary new sightings by Dr. Mark Olson. We know Dr. Mark Olson. He's been on Dreamland. His interviews in our subscriber section are available for subscribers to listen to at any time or download. Well, more stuff is happening there. Something's going on with Mark Olson. Here she is from Albuquerque, Linda Moulton Howe.
Thanks, Whitley. It was about 2 years ago, in November 2003, that these two brothers moved together into an apartment on the outskirts of Sonora, California. And one of those brothers is named Mark Olson. He is a high school graduate who is a certified interpreter for the deaf, computer business specialist, and a graduate of the Universal Life Seminary with a doctorate degree in metaphysics. Mark had no specific interest, he says, in the UFO phenomenon when he and his brother decided to live in the rural community and split living costs. But only a few months after moving into their new place, Mark noticed a large bruise on the small of his brother's back. His brother was not aware of any trauma and did not even know he had a bruise. So Mark got his webcam out and took an image that showed the bruise. A couple of days later, his brother became ill with a low temperature and then for 3 days woke up with a bloody right nostril. Mark Olson recently contacted me about the strange events that he and his brother have witnessed and videotaped the past year at their Sonora, California apartment. And here is Mark now picking up the story from March 2004 after his brother had the repeating bloody nostril.
A couple days after that, he came home and he was scratching his ear. And that gave me goosebumps. And I told him, let me see your ear. He turned around and there was behind his ear was this long, red, raw scar or mark or cut or something. And that's when I started wondering what was going on because I have the exact same scar behind my ear.
And you associate yours with abductions by non-humans?
I think so, yes. I'm not positive. I'm not for sure about it. But there has been some very strange dreamlike memories in my past, as well as my mother's and my sister's. And all of us have the same mark on our legs, a triangular mark, kind of like a scoop out of the skin.
And which leg?
On the left inner thigh.
Left inner thigh. And the types of beings that you, your mom, and sister have seen in dreams, what have they been like?
Well, the only thing I can remember is beings that were slightly taller than me. I'm not very tall. I only stand 5 foot tall. And this is when I was a child, and these people were just slightly taller than me. And there were lots of them, and they were moving around me very fast. And they weren't talking. It was very scary. And I must have cried out or something, because all of a sudden, all of them at the same time turned towards me and came at me. And when I wanted to scream, I couldn't scream, I couldn't move. And the next thing I remember after that was my mother shaking me in bed and telling me to wake up, wake up. She's shaking me, I'm awake. And I couldn't move, and I couldn't tell her I was awake.
Mm-hmm. And what year would this be, Mark?
This would have been 1971 or 72.
And you would have been how old?
5 or 6 years old.
You were born in?
I was born in 1966.
Over this time period, up until you moved with your brother into the apartment in Sonora, had you ever had what you considered to be conscious face-to-face with entities?
No. Okay. Nothing conscious. That's why I'm not sure that I could actually call it an abduction scenario. I have no idea what happened, except that I ended up with a scar. I have scars all over my body, and I can tell you exactly where, when, and how they happened.
Right.
Except for this one scar.
And when you've asked your mother about it and your sister, what do they say?
Well, I remember asking my mom, and I was wearing shorts, and I showed her the mark. The first thing out of her mouth was, "Where did you get that?" And it startled me because she sounded upset. Mm-hmm. And that's when I told her I was just going to ask you that. And that's when she showed me her scar. Mm-hmm. And she told me that when she was about 5 or 6 years old, she remembers being in what she described as a doctor's office, being held down on a table and being told she was going to get some kind of a shot or inoculation. And she was screaming and trying to get up, and they wouldn't let her up. The weird thing was, she said that she saw my grandmother standing nearby, staring at her, face impassive, not moving. She says that she truly believes in her heart that we have been experimented on. And that just gives me the creeps. Because to hear my mother has always been down-to-earth, logical person. And for her to make a statement like that just seems like unreal, surrealistic. It just doesn't make sense to me that she could say something like that. My mother is the one that needs proof for anything.
Could you start now and explain what it was that you saw first that puzzled you and that has made you for the last 2 years use your camera so much?
Well, while I was seeing these incidents with my brother, I decided to borrow a digital camera from a neighbor so that I could document what was happening. While I was trying to learn how to use it, I was taking pictures of things inside and outside of the house, flowers, sky, airplanes, trees, whatever I could. And while I was taking pictures, I noticed a few days after I downloaded them to the computer on this digital camera, there were objects showing up in the pictures that I didn't see when I was taking the pictures. And that was happening so much, I decided on May 13th of last year to go out and buy a digital camcorder. Once I got the camcorder, I started practicing it with it, and the very next day, I videotaped this object that I was watching an airplane in the contrail, and this object just dropped down from the top of the screen above the plane or slightly behind it, went behind the contrail, did a crazy maneuver where it looked like it stopped on a dime a couple times, and then shot straight back up again in front of the contrail.
And you and I were looking at that together on our computers today, and I reminded you that it looks almost identical to the unidentified white object that made a circular pattern around the very first version flight of the Concorde back in the 60s.
Mm-hmm. And I've never seen that in video either.
But it still is this, the question remains, in our skies, in our atmosphere, there are round objects, cylindrical objects, triangular objects, and these white, almost glowing objects that seem to monitor or somehow be involved with aircraft that we have in the skies.
Yes.
Out of everything that you have seen and videotaped over the last year or so, what is the very strangest?
Let's see. There was the cylinder in bright daylight, which was back in June of 2004. And that object I looked up and I thought I was watching an airplane, except that it wasn't moving. And when I grabbed my camcorder and looked through the camcorder, I could not see wings, tail fins, nothing. This was just a cylinder with squared off ends and a black line 2/3 of the way down. So it kind of looked like an exclamation point.
And do you have that posted at your website under a specific date?
Yes, that would be June 10th of 2004.
Okay.
On the May and June clips page.
Now, what else has really sort of haunted you?
Haunted me would be the daytime triangle. Oh, man. Back on June 15th, 5 days after the cylinder, I went out on my back porch, sat down, looked up, and saw a flash over the trees, which are about 100 yards away from me. And I thought it was an airplane reflecting the sunlight. But when I looked through my camcorder, I saw 3 lights in a triangular formation with a 4th light in the middle, but I could not see the craft they were attached to. And they moved very, very slowly to my south from the left to the right as I was facing northeast. And they were moving to the south and went, there's a tree about 20 feet away from my back balcony, a small pine tree. And this object went behind the branches as it flew. And that's also included on my website.
And in fact, I believe that is your featured photograph on most of your pages in the upper right-hand corner.
Yes, that one was one of the most amazing ones I've seen.
And the photograph itself is puzzling because it seems to be almost like a pattern of glowing things, but not so much the way we think of structure as an airplane.
Correct. When I look at it, it looks like the 3 outer lights are in a triangular formation, but the 4th one seems to be a little bit farther away, almost as if it was a flying pyramid.
Now, when you and your brother talk about all of this accumulation of all of these unexplained sightings that have so many patterns, have been coming pretty consistently since you've moved up there, do either of you ever think, is this related in any way to your childhood memories, the triangular scars and the strange bruise on his back?
Yes, I'm constantly thinking about it, trying to remember if there's anything in my past that could connect these things. And I can't think of anything. When I asked my brother about it, He says, I don't know, but he has a tendency, he does not want to know. He just knows that something happened to him, but he said, he told me one day, he says, I'm glad I don't remember what happened. I don't think I could handle it.
In 2005, since January, just in the last 4 months, what has been, from your point of view, the most spectacular aerial events that you've seen with your eyes and been able to document on camera?
Okay. Back in January, I acquired a couple of other people that are interested in these objects and have been willing to go out and videotape with me. On January 14th, we went up to a place near a town called Twainhart, which overlooks the valley and looks over Lions Bald Mountain. And while we were out there on January 14th, several objects were videotaped by both cameras and both cameramen. On January 14th, one of the most spectacular, there was an object that actually looked like it was changing shape as it was flying over Lions Bald Mountain. That was about 9:27 p.m. And then shortly after that, about 20 minutes later, a color-changing object showed up.
Now, could you start with we'll call it the shape changer, and explain what you saw first and what kept changing?
Well, as I was facing west, I was looking over the mountain, and I saw this object just flying, and I thought at first maybe it was an airplane, except that I did not see any FAA lights. When I looked at it through my camcorder and started videotaping it, the object actually changed shape. It started out round, then kind of morphed into the cylinder thing, and it was changing shape. It looked at one point like it had arms and legs. These streamer kind of things came out of it. And it just kept changing shape as it moved. And I videotaped it for a few seconds before it disappeared. And
Mark, which date on your website is this one?
This one is under the January. It's January 14th.
2005.
2005, and it is one of several that was videotaped that night.
And people can go to www.sonorasightings.com and can find in the far left that there is an index, and you can click on January 2005 and find this video clip.
Correct.
Now, after this video, you said about 20 minutes later, an object showed up changing color. Can you describe that in more detail?
Yes, this object was seen over Lions Bald Mountain again, and it was changing colors. It was a huge ball of light that went from white, red, orange, yellow, green, blue. It was just changing colors. And as we were watching it, this one we videotaped for quite a while, for a few minutes at least. And as we were watching it, I decided to see what would happen if I flashed a flashlight at it. I took out the flashlight and I signaled it. The object then stopped, changed direction, and took off really fast, just in the opposite direction that it was coming from. And this was captured on 2 cameras.
And so no signaling to you, but a disappearance by flying away.
Uh-huh. It was more like it said, oops, we've been seen, let's get out of here. It was the strangest thing I've ever seen.
And there were 2 of you who were seeing both the shape changer and the color changer object?
Correct.
And both of those videotapes you have represented at your website?
Yes, there's video clips of both of those objects. On the color-changing object, we videotaped it. We have 4 separate clips, 2 from one camera, 2 from the other, showing first the color changing as it was just changing colors flying over the mountain. And then the second 2 clips are from when I signaled the flashlight and its reaction to it.
And that's January
14th.
2005.
Correct.
Did you try to contact any airport people, military people, police, anybody, and say, this is what's happening above Sonora? Do you know what it could be?
I have tried contacting our local media. I've contacted the Sheriff's Department. I've contacted everybody I could think of, even our small aircraft airport, which is in another town right outside of Sonora in Colombia. And I've not received any replies to my queries.
You just don't get a reply at all?
No reply whatsoever. One time when I called the airport, They said, hold on. They put me on hold and never came back.
And your website has kept accumulating with what seems to me to be quite an assortment of, at least, let's put it this way, unexplained videos?
Yes. I call them unidentified aerial phenomena because I have no other idea what they are. I don't want to call them UFOs because that has the negative connotation of being spaceships.
Right.
And I don't know whether they're terrestrial or extraterrestrial.
Right. Now that comes to the videotapes that you have of what look like a triangular pattern of lights. Mm-hmm. Could you talk about some of the triangles that you have gotten with that clear understanding that we don't know exactly what the source is, but describe some of the triangular patterns you've gotten on tape?
Sure. One night back in May of last year, on May 31st, I was sitting outside with a friend of mine. The moon was almost full, and it was behind us. This object appeared above Lions Bald Mountain, and when I looked at it through my camcorder, it had 2 lights. But as it came closer to us, we noticed that there were 3 lights. As we were both watching it, my friend says, do you see that airplane that's right next to it? So I backed off the focus a little bit, and you can see this huge past the helicopter. It looked like the helicopter actually had to get out of its way. That was the first one that we saw, and it was just amazing.
And how is that identified at your website? Which date?
That would be under the May of 2004 video clip. This triangular object was moving so slow that if it were a conventional aircraft, it would have fallen out of the sky.
And could you hear any sound?
None whatsoever. We did hear the helicopter, because the object was a helicopter, even though my friend thought it was a plane. And you could hear the helicopter clearly.
But no interaction between the helicopter and the object that had first 2 lights and then seemed to have 3 in a triangular pattern?
No interaction except for the fact that it passed right by the helicopter. Mm-hmm. We videotaped the thing all the way across the sky for at least 5 minutes.
So it was moving that slowly?
Yes, very slowly.
Now, how many times have you seen this triangular pattern of lights that makes no sound?
5 times now. And each time, these objects are moving very slowly. They have 1 red light and 2 green lights. And they're huge. They are just huge compared to other aircraft that we've been monitoring here.
And that color configuration, how does that compare to normal civilian or military airplane?
Well, usually a normal aircraft has 1 red light, 1 green light, and 1 white light, or any combination thereof. But they're all, most of the time, the white and the red lights blink as for the FAA signaling. It's mandated by the FAA.
And these unusual triangular objects do what?
They don't signal at all. They don't blink. The lights don't glow like in airplanes. They have some kind of a diffuse look to them. They're pretty. They are very pretty lights, but they're huge. These objects these lights are spaced so that they're 2 or 3 times bigger than these airplanes. In the last year, I have seen more over Sonora than I have ever seen anywhere. I've never seen so many different kinds of objects, different colors, cylinders, triangles, disc shapes, orbs, white ones, and bright lights at night. These are just amazing to me. It's amazing that the government won't talk about them, but it's also, it seems clear to me that the government has encouraged the notion that people that see these things are eccentric.
Because then it takes the heat off of their having to explain what they might be or that they don't know what they are.
One thing is for sure, I am not seeing marsh gas reflecting the light of Venus.
When you see things you're videotaping, do you feel that you expect all of this to lead up to something?
Yeah, I do. I feel like there's something is going to happen. Something is on the edge of happening. That's what it feels like. And it's felt that way for a year now. There is a really strange part of this. When these objects appeared, when they first started appearing, I would be sitting on my back porch reading, which I do a lot of. And one day I was sitting out there reading and enjoying a really good part of a really good book. and I felt like somebody was trying to get my attention, like somebody was looking at you, the feeling in the back of your head.
Right.
And I put the book down and looked straight up. I didn't look around me. I didn't look over the mountain. I just looked straight up, and there's 2 silver discs hovering above my head. And every time we have a sighting, or most of the time, we get these feelings that something's going to happen. I've asked my brother about it. He gets the same feelings. And we'll get really strange tingles, feeling like, okay, something's going to happen. We better go outside. So we'll go outside and watch, and sure enough, something will happen.
It's almost as if something is teaching you and others in the abduction syndrome about paying attention to certain feelings that are linked in some way to visible sightings or perhaps even telepathic communication. And then that goes to the next question, what could that be leading up to that you feel that we're on the edge of something big happening?
I've been feeling something is going to happen, and I also have a feeling it has to do with our planet, not just with our people.
Mark told me that he has investigated and that in the Sonora Pass region, which is about 20 to 25 miles away from their apartment, that there is a sign that simply says Marine Corps Training Camp, and it seems to be occupied only during the winter season when it is completely blocked off. It's a question in my mind, Whitley, could there be an underground installation in this mountain in which all of this continues to occur, and could it in any way be related both to military operations and to something that you and I and others have caught on to for a long time, and that is there seems to be a point-counterpoint monitoring between whatever it is that comes here and our military.
Well, there is some sort of relationship, very definitely, and the interesting thing is it our military, or is it something made to look like our military to
right.
us? And I don't know the answer to that question, but I do know that the closer you get to it, and I have been down this road many, many times, the harder it becomes to verify anything about the military aspect of it, except that it's there.
Right. That's right. And that Lion's Bald Mountain, I would sure like to know more. Mark has tried to learn more, but no one seems to know anything about any association. But I myself have begun to suspect that there are mountainous regions all over the country in which there could be underground installations.
Well, I have the possibility of going and spending some time out there on that mountain. I'm certainly not going to let anybody know when that's going to happen until after it happens. I'm not even Mark. But I have been working on it myself, and we'll see. There's great stuff upcoming on Dreamland. David Icke at some point is going to be with us. William Henry's going to be interviewing Lawrence Gardner, and so am I, about his fantastic new book, The Magdalene Legacy. Jim Mars, our new second guest host. We have a new guest host. His first interview is going to be with Ed Haslam very soon, and that is going to be explosive. We will be talking to Greg Bishop about the Paul Benowitz case where government disinformation operatives drove a man mad. But nevertheless, he does exist, contrary to all indications otherwise. Howe and Russell were really the pioneers of remote viewing in this country, and there's also, Russell has published a paper in the AAAS journal, and a lot of previously secret remote viewing material has been made public. So we're going to be going through that today, and I think you're going to find it fascinating. And this is one of these programs that Dreamland is really all about. It's about empowerment, and one of the things that hurts us in our growth psychically is the relentless drilling into our minds that we are nothing more than a physical body, and this comes to us. Everything the consumer society has to say at its core is this, and it is constricting and starving our relationship with other levels of reality. Here is a scientist we're going to be talking to who is comfortable not only with other levels of reality, but understands the science of why they're real. Welcome to the program, Russell Targ.
I'm very happy to be with you. I'm glad to talk with you about some of my favorite subjects.
Well, good. Well, let's begin at the beginning. One of the things that we never get to hear is the story of how you came to the remote viewing idea in the first place.
Well, remote viewing was brought to us by Ingo Swann, who was a New York artist and prodigious psychic before we started our program at SRI.
Now, how did you
grew up
meet
in
Ingo?
New York as a street kid visiting magic shops on 42nd Street. And I was an amateur magician. And like many amateur magicians, I had the experience that from time to time, I would get flashes of hidden information pertaining to the trick I was doing that could supplement my sleight of hand or my trickery by some genuine ESP. And in talking with other magicians, even though they may hate psychic functioning, it's well known that when you're standing on a stage with the lights in your eyes, you're in a kind of hypnagogic state and open to psychic abilities. So as a young physics student, I became interested in the real examination of psychic abilities rather than the stage magic, and I began to pursue that and built an ESP teaching machine. And then to answer your question, in 1972, Al Puthoff and I got together to form a research program at Stanford Research Institute to investigate whether we could teach people how to get in touch with the part of themselves that's psychic. While Hal and I were both physicists, we were taught by Ingo Swann about remote viewing, the ability to quiet your mind and describe and experience what's going on in distant places. And we became very, very good at helping people learn to do remote viewing, to describe things hundreds of thousands of miles away. And Ingo taught Hal and me to do remote viewing. Hal and I taught 6 people from Army intelligence who were supporting our program. So the Army formed a parallel program to Stanford Research Institute, and we trained 6 of the Army intelligence people how to use remote viewing, basically to spy on the Russians and do other...
Thanks, Whitley. Well, you know, at first, the idea that poisonous cane toads, originally from Venezuela, South America, would crawl out of a lake near Hamburg, Germany, and explode to death sounds like a Monty Python comedy. But over 5 days between April 3rd and April 7th of 2005, an estimated 1,000 cane toads did exactly that. This week, I talked to Werner Smolnik, the Hamburg, Germany project leader for NABU, the oldest German society for protection of plants and animals. He watched this baffling phenomenon with his own eyes, and Mr. Smolnik told me, quote, "The toads, they came out of the water onto the land, and in the time of 10 minutes, they increased to nearly 4 times their normal size and then exploded. I have seen the toad intestines flying 1 meter," unquote. Several exploded toad carcasses were delivered to Hamburg city veterinarian Dr. Otto Horst. He told me that he had never seen such toad explosions before and confirmed that so far no chemicals, pesticides, bacteria, or viruses have been found that might explain these toad explosions.
Linda, I'm sorry, it's just killing me. I know it's not funny, but it is terribly funny. But go ahead.
Well, it's also, you know, it's like another warning flag in the environment.
Oh, undoubtedly, it's going to turn out to be something horrendous. But go ahead, keep going. I'm sorry to interrupt you.
That's all right. Mr. Smolnik told me that he was trying to research a rumor that similar cane toad deaths occurred in South America in 2002 to 2003, but neither of us have been able to find any past news reports. One theory was that horses were transporting a toxic yeast from mushrooms into testing one of those remedies in the German and Denmark waters. And at the end of this Dreamland program, I'll have another Earth mystery from the skies over Sonora, California, west of Yosemite National Park.
Well, you know, Linda, there's an awful lot of weird stuff going on. We have a story up on Unknown Country the past couple of days that to the effect that not only are toads exploding, but dogs in Glasgow are committing suicide by all jumping off the same spot on a bridge in the middle of the city. Exactly. What is going on this planet? Absolutely. Linda Moulton Howe's ever fabulous website, earthfiles.com. Do not miss it. Go to earthfiles.com frequently. Subscribe to earthfiles.com. It's well worth it. Stay abreast of what's happening in your world. The conventional media does not help you. It will not help you. This is where the real information is found. Well, I'm very happy and proud to have with me today Russell Targ. Russell Targ is one of the inventors of remote viewing, along with Dr. Hal Puthoff. You talk about getting it from the horse's mouth. This is the man who really knows what it's all about. He is now back again for a remarkably interesting reason. The original book on remote viewing, Mind Reach, out of print and unobtainable for years, is now available again, and you can get it from the unknowncountry.com store. You can get it in bookstores everywhere. And Russell, of course, is one of the authors, along with the famous and elusive Hal Puthoff, a dear friend of mine who will not, under any circumstances, talk with me on my radio program.
River and lake water. But Dr. Horst told me he does not think that is the explanation in Hamburg. Mr. Smolnik said that he had not received any more exploding toad reports after April 7th, but on April 25th, about 200 miles north of Hamburg in Aarhus County, Denmark, the Ritzau news agency reported, quote, a large number of toads in Lasby, Middle Jutland, northwest of Copenhagen, have begun to climb on land where they swell up and explode. The toad's intestines are thrown almost a meter in the air after the toads explode. Investigators found a rock covered with the bodies of many dead exploded toads. The toads seem to be exploding between 2 a.m. and 3 a.m. in the night, unquote. Well, perhaps the exploding cane toads is caused by people deliberately poisoning them in some way. Anywhere that the poisonous cane toads turn up, people begin wanting to kill them. 5 months ago, on November 4th, 2004, David Tallner, a member of the Australian Parliament, used his official post to call for the, quote, bashing of poisonous cane toads with cricket bats and golf clubs, unquote. Cane toads were brought to Queensland from South America in the 1930s to try to control beetles that were destroying sugarcane fields on the northern Australian coast. But the cane toads, which have poisonous sacs on their back of their heads that can kill crocodiles, snakes, and other animals in literally minutes, they have spread so rapidly now in Australia that there are millions. The Australian Northern Territory government has been spending $1 million recently to research biotechnological remedies to the toad invasion. Maybe someone is